Welcome to the Mob Museum. My name is Jeff Schumacher. I'm the Vice President of Exhibits and Programs here. Thank you for coming out for tonight's program, which I trust you will find it to be enlightening and entertaining both. Our subject is organized crime in Detroit. I really enjoy these programs in which we do an in-depth exploration of the underworld of a particular city. We've done a few of these, and tonight Detroit goes under the microscope. Detroit is without question in the top 5, maybe top 3 U.S. cities when it comes to the depth and drama of its mob history. And we have the bonus that Detroit's tentacles have often spread to Las Vegas. Our panelists tonight will give us some incredible insights into the Motor City. By the way, this program coincides with the recent completion of a new exhibit on the 3rd floor that has a distinctive Detroit flavor to it. If you haven't checked it out, I hope you'll do so. The National Syndicate exhibit, is what we call it, and it includes some great artifacts from Detroit police detective William Delisle, dating back to the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and Detroit police officer Ben Turpin. So if you get a chance, please check out our new exhibit. I will briefly introduce our speakers, and then we'll jump into our conversation. We'll leave time at the end for you to ask a few questions as well, and please be thinking about the questions you have as we go through the conversation. We'll start with the speaker on my left, Scott Burnstein. Scott undoubtedly will look familiar to some of you. He has spoken at the Mob Museum a few times before. He's also appeared on a number of documentaries and docuseries on mob topics, and he's written several books, including Motor City Mafia, A Century of Organized Crime in Detroit. He's a writer, podcaster, and film producer. Further, he's a member of the Mob Museum's Advisory Council, and he has a personal connection to the story we will tell tonight. Please welcome Scott Burnstein.
Thank you.
To my far left is Nove Tocco. Nove's last name is synonymous with Detroit organized crime. And in the coming hour, you will learn more about that. Nove was a soldier in the Detroit family for many years and served 2 stints in prison as a result of his activities. He also was involved in Las Vegas, which we will discuss in some detail. Most importantly, I think tonight marks the first time Nove has spoken about his past on a public stage like this. Please welcome Nove Tocco.
Thank you.
So I thought we would start. As a historian, I always want to know the backstory, right? How does this all get started? And I thought Scott would be perfectly qualified to give us a sort of a Mob 101 of Detroit from the Purple Gang to the 1960s in about 5 minutes.
Nove set the over-under at 7 and a half.
But if he misses a few things, of course, we'll come back to him. But if you could do that, Scott, then we will proceed from there.
So the Detroit Mafia, which was known locally as the Tocco Zerilli family, was created out of what was known in Michigan newspapers and radio coverage at that time of the crosstown mob war. And it was a all-out kind of bloodbath pitting the east side of the city, which was Nove's family, versus the west side of the city. And it lasted about 2 years. And what it did was consolidate all of the street factions in Detroit that were operating during Prohibition all came under one banner in 1931, when Nove's grandfather, Joe Zerilli, and his uncle, Black Bill Tocco, won the crosstown mob war and took power. Now, the name that was really synonymous with underworld activity in Detroit during Prohibition wasn't Zerilli and Tocco, despite the fact that they had, big reputations and big profiles locally. The marquee name, both in Detroit and nationally, was the Purple Gang. And that was the Jewish mob, and that was ran by the 4 Burnstein brothers, who were cousins of mine. Abe, Joe, Ray, and Izzy founded and led the Purple Gang, which had a very positive relationship with the Zerilli Tocco family, opposed to a lot of what people may have read. There's been a lot of twisted narratives out there over the years that there was some type of acrimony between the Purples and the Zerilli Toccos, and that wasn't true at all. The Zerilli Toccos had an issue with another group of Italians led by a guy named Cesare Big Chet Lamare. That was what that crosstown mob war was about. It had nothing to do with the Purple Gang and the Tocco Zerilli crew going to war. In fact, they were allies, and when Prohibition was over, most of the Purple Gang tapped out and went and took the money that they had made bootlegging and went into legitimate businesses. There were a number of purple remnants, if you will, that became absorbed by the Italian syndicate, the Tocco Zerilli group. Under Nove's grandfather, Joe Zerilli, one of the most revered mafia dons in American history, he ruled for over 4 decades. I believe he was the second or third longest reigning don in American history. And he built a family that was the picture of stability and functionality. And he did that because of what I call the 4 golden rules of Joe Zerilli, Nove's grandfather. And then I'll turn it back over to these guys to color this up. But he built this crime family with 4 golden rules. And the golden rules were diversification, which was twofold. Diversification in the sense that everybody that was a member of the family had to have legitimate income to put on a tax return. Also diversification in the sense of, the whole politicized term lately, diversity, equity, inclusion. This was a Tocco Zerilli thing 100 years ago. They were all about diversity, equity, inclusion. If you could make money for them, you could be their best friend, and you didn't have to be Italian. So they opened up the family, not officially, but unofficially, the family was opened up to Jews, African Americans, Irish, Polish, and we have a lot of Middle Easterners in Detroit. So diversification, insulation, in that Detroit created a buffer system where the boss or the underboss or the consigliere wasn't directly dealing with the street. You'd have a lot of buffers and layers before you could get to them, and that helped prevent prosecutions. Education was the third one, and that was an edict put in by his grandfather that all the second and third generation members of the family, if they wanted to come in to the crime syndicate, they had to go to college and get college business degrees. And then the fourth was what I call genetic isolation, and that is everybody is going to marry everybody else, and everybody's grandfather or everybody's son is going to marry somebody else's daughter, somebody's nephew is going to marry somebody else's niece. It makes it very difficult for a family to go to war with each other if they're actually, the same bloodline. And when I say isolation, I mean if you weren't with them, you weren't with them, and you kind of had to be with them from the time you left the womb. So it wasn't easy. And in most families, anybody that was Italian could get in to a crime family. In Detroit, you had to be Sicilian. It was very specific. So from that, Zerilli built a family that took over the unions, took over, and Nove has a little bit of disagreement with some of the semantics here, took over the narcotics industry and took over construction, sanitation. And by the 60s, 70s, when Nove was coming on the scene, they really were the gold standard, not just for the Midwest or Detroit, but they were up there with all the New York families. They had a seat on the commission. His grandfather was known as kind of the quasi-consigliere of the commission. Anytime the commission had issues they needed to have a mediator, they would go to his grandfather.
Great job, John.
a little over, probably.
Was that under 5?
Over.
Oh, okay.
Now, I want to turn to Nove. So, Nove, why don't we start, as we do often, at the beginning.
Okay.
And let's talk about, you talked about the Sicilian roots of the family and about growing up in this family. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, first of all, the men in this organization had daughters, and their daughters were expected to marry other Sicilian men. My my mother was Joe Zerilli's second child, and she married my father, which was the youngest child of a man by the name of Nove Tocco. That's who I'm named after. Nove's an Italian nickname that my father gave me. And my grandfather Onovrio was quite a bit older than my other grandfather, and mentored him when he came to this country. My grandfather Zerilli came to this country as a very poor man. He had nothing. He came here because he came to this country and went to Detroit because he had an older married sister that lived in Detroit, and he took menial jobs until he learned how to make a living on the street. And like I said, my father, when he became of age, he asked for my mother. My grandfather Zerilli stopped him, and he said he had to wait until after World War II because my grandfather didn't want his daughter to end up a widow if her husband got killed in the war. My father did not go into war because he was the youngest son who supported his elderly parents, who were both retired and rather old, and all his brothers were in the war, and he was the last remaining man with that name to carry on, and he was given a deferment because of it, because he supported his family. I was born into that family. I was the oldest grandson of Mr. Zerilli, and very frankly, there's no better word. I was born a prince. I never knew why that people acquiesced to me and my wishes and made things easier for me than they were. And as I grew older, I learned. You learn certain things. I was growing up and expected to be a man, and be a man by the standards of men that came from Victorian Europe. And what it meant to be a man was their standards of a man, not what we know today. If a man was to take a wife, he was to have children. He was to protect her under all circumstances and take care of his family under all circumstances. That's what it was expected of me, and that was what I was taught. As a very young man, it became kind of, I guess, obvious to the older people that I had a little bit of a physical endowment to engage in physical activity, I guess. I don't know. They said the first time I ever had a fight was, I was in Miami Beach. I was 2 years old. I had an older cousin, a girl older cousin that was getting pushed around by another wise guy's son who was 5, and I went up and punched him in the mouth and made him cry. And my great uncle, who was the street boss of Detroit at the time, picked me up and was carrying me around the beach saying, "This kid's got it in him." So I guess after that, my cast was kind of put in front of me. I grew up and I was taught, when you go to school, you take care of the other Italian kids. You don't let other people bully them because they're smaller. As I said, I had a little propensity in that. I boxed when I was a young man, and I wasn't afraid to tangle it up, so I was the one that had to go protect. There's a family in Tucson now, and one of the sons of a gentleman who has passed away was part of it, by the name of, you guys know him out here as Licavoli. His name was in Italian, was Licavoli. And Pete was this kind of a smart-mouthed little kid, and he got me in more fights than I ever know. And every time I got called on the carpet by my grandfather, "What are you doing getting in a fight?" I said, "You know, Pete," he says, "All right, never mind, don't worry about it." Anyway, it became obvious from the time 12 or 13 years old that something was special was with my grandfather. I was spoiled to a degree. I mean, we didn't want for anything. He had a cottage in Higgins Lake in northern Michigan, and he also had a ranch. He was partners with my great uncle, Peter Corrado. They had a 1,500-acre ranch, and they raised horses and cattle. I grew up running around that ranch and riding horses and roping cows and everything that people do. And I realized that I had a life that other kids didn't have. And I also started to realize that for some reason, in my grandfather's neighborhood in Grosse Pointe Park, which is a suburb of Detroit, my great uncle, William Tocco, his nickname was Black Bill, and my other great uncle, Peter Corrado, his nickname was the Clown, and Piazzo in Sicilian, but the clown does not mean what you think of as a clown as somebody dressed up. It means somebody who loves life and loves fun. That's what it means in Sicilian. They would turn everything into a party.
Let me just interrupt 1 second. One of the first times I met Novi, he took issue with the fact that you keep on calling my uncle Pete Corrado Machine Gun Pete. That was his nickname in the newspapers. And he was like, I just want to tell you that was not his nickname. His nickname was
Piazzo.
Piazzo, and it was somewhat of a misnomer that Machine Gun Pete or Pete Corrado was not this, crazy lunatic killer. He was actually kind of a kibitzer, and he didn't have the personality didn't necessarily meet the nickname.
At any rate, always in that neighborhood, in those days, you're talking about in the early 50s, in the middle 50s, they were always working on the telephone lines. What it really was the federal government was tapping the wires. In those days, they didn't have the technology. And they'd put these tents on the top of these telephone poles, and it'd either be across the street from my grandfather, across the street from my Uncle Pete, across the street from my Uncle Bill. And they were always there. Well, me and my brother would walk around, we knew what was going on. We'd kick the ladders out, and then these guys would come out screaming at us. We said, go ahead, get down.
Novi, so this is something that alludes back to something Scott said about education. So one thing you did is you went to college, but you didn't go necessarily to the college you wanted to go to. Is that right?
No, I went to the University of Detroit, in which my uncle, Tony Zerilli, my grandfather's only son that survived, went to college there. My uncle Bill Tocco's son, Jack, who later ran the family, went to college at the University of Detroit. My uncle Pete Corrado, his oldest son, Dominic, went to college at the University of Detroit. And also at that time, at the end of the 40s, when they were going to college, all the future politicians of Detroit, the Mayor Kavanaugh, Grimm, a lot of them politicians were going to school at the University of Detroit. It was a Catholic Jesuit-run college, and that was it. When I got out of high school, I went 1 year to a small college by the name of Detroit Institute of Technology, and I was on the honor roll. So I was offered a position by the University of Miami. They said, we'll give you a 50% scholarship, and if you could make the football team, we'll pick up the other 50%. So I went to my father. I said, hey, Dad, I'm going to go to the University of Miami. Look what they're doing. He said, you're going to do what? I said, I'm going to the University of Miami. He said, you ain't going nowhere. I said, Dad, they're going to pick up. He says, I don't care. You're going to the University of Detroit. I said, why do I got to go there? He said, because your uncle went there. That's where you're going. Now shut up and go sit down. That's the way life was. Everybody now, they want to go to the toilet. Not in my family. That wasn't the way it was. I ended up going to the University of Detroit in about 1966, 1967. I think I was a sophomore in college. Every Sunday we went to my grandfather's house, and his children and all of their children had Sunday dinner. 3 o'clock every Sunday afternoon we had dinner. And we all had seats that you sat in, and I sat next to my father, and then my brother was next to him, and so on. It was according to age. And my uncle, Tony Zerilli, said to me, he says, next month you're out of school for a while. I says, yeah, we're in between semesters. He says, come on, kid, you're coming with me. We're going to, and you're going to learn the fine Italian hand works in this country. I said, well, what the hell are you talking about? He says, you're going to learn. He says, you're coming with me. From there, I went with him to New Orleans, in which I met some of the people from New Orleans. I went to California. I met some people from California. Went to Phoenix, in which some people that had originally lived in Detroit were. I met them, and then we came to Las Vegas. I stayed at the Desert Inn with my uncle. We were there for about 5 or 6 weeks, I believe. And that's where the deal was cut for the Detroit family to take over the Frontier Hotel, which is not there anymore, I understand. Detroit already had a piece of the Silver Slipper, which was just a casino next door. And in 1950, which was, I was 3 years old, so I can't tell you for sure, they had a little piece of the DI. In fact, some of the kids,
The Desert Inn.
the Desert Inn,
yeah.
yeah, the DI, yeah. I'm sorry, they didn't know what the DI. That's what it was called in those days, the Desert Inn.
Yeah. Locals would know. Local folks would know. Call it the DI as well.
Yeah. And that's where I met a lot of people. I met a man from Kansas City, and I was in the room. I was a young man, and I didn't partake in the meeting, but I was there to get drinks, cigars, and whatever. And I was enthralled with it. And my uncle wanted me to go to take a course at Michigan State University in hotel and restaurant management, and eventually come out here and take over that hotel. I didn't like that idea too much, and my father said no, and that was the end of that. But I was here. I came back many times in the late 60s and 70s. We did a little business in this town. In the 60s and 70s, and into the 80s, into the 90s, I was shylocking. And shylocking, for those that don't know, it's named after a character in a Shakespearean play. It's a usurious moneylender, but...
Loan shark.
Loan shark, okay. I never used that term. It's called shylocks, anyway. And I would charge 3% a week on the outstanding loan. But I never used my own money. I used to borrow it from Jewish people. I paid them 1%. So they were my partners. And
Literally my relatives.
And nowadays, I went to prison for things like that, and I was charging 3% a week. They charging at these payday loans 600% a month here. I don't know what they charge. I didn't charge that much.
Novi, I want to go back just for a minute to Las Vegas, 1966, 67, when you're here. What was it like? Because there's so many people in Las Vegas, and there's a few people in the room who will remember that, but not that many. What was it like in Las Vegas at that time?
Do you know the scene in The Godfather where they have the picture of the old Desert Inn?
Yeah.
That's exactly what it looked like. There were spaces in between the Desert Inn, the Sands, the Tropicana, the Flamingo. Down the street was El Morocco. Across the street from the DI was the Silver Slipper. They had just built Circus and Caesar's Palace. The original part of Caesar's Palace, not all the buildings you see today, was there. And as we were flying into Las Vegas, my uncle told us a little story. My uncle told me, he says, listen, Jimmy Hoffa made the deal for the Caesar's Palace. He said, but he oversold it, and he owes some people. He sold like 120%, and he owes some people the money. He says, so if you're in the Caesar's Palace at the graveyard shift, 4 in the morning, he said, don't go doing any gambling, that the crap tables are taking the people off. Okay. I find myself 4 o'clock in the morning at Caesar's Palace. And here comes a couple of big Texans, and they got women on both arms. And they go up to the crap table. So I figured, hey, this is a chance to make a payday. I went up to the crap table, and I bet $100 on the don't pass. I win. Next guy dice passes to the next guy, and I bet $200 on the don't pass. I win. I go to bet $400 on the don't pass. I get a big hand on my shoulder. The guy says, hey, Novi, you made your payday. Get the hell out of here. That's what Caesar's Palace was like in those days. Every hotel we went into, somebody knew somebody. I remember having dinner with a bunch of men from all over the country. I think a gentleman from Kansas City, a gentleman from St. Louis, my uncle, another man from Detroit, myself. We had dinner at, it was a restaurant in the Dunes. It was the Gourmet House, the gourmet restaurant in the Dunes, and I don't remember the name of it. And that was my introduction to people around this country. And some of the names of these people you've heard, you see on the walls in this building, and I knew a lot of them. Some of the men that you see on the walls of this building, my family was married into some of their families. And
well, one of those families that we should mention, and you can both speak to this, was We talked about the intermarriage within Detroit, but then you guys were really tied in with the Profaci family as well, out of New York.
My uncle, my grandfather's son, only son, Tony, was married to Mr. Joe Profaci's oldest daughter, Rosalie. She's my godmother. I've known her as long as I can remember.
She's the archetype, the basis of Connie Corleone. And the opening scene of The Godfather, where you see that was partially inspired by his uncle marrying Rosalie Profaci.
And Mr. Profaci's second daughter, Carmela, was married to my cousin, my Uncle Bill's second son, Tony. And because in the Zerilli family, there were so many Tonys, Tony Zerilli, because the way we had rules on how you had to name your children. That's why I'm named after my father's father. The oldest son is named after the father's father. The second son is named after the mother's father. The third son is named after the father. Same rules for daughters. The oldest daughter's named after the father's mother. The second daughter's named after the mother's mother. And the third daughter's named after the mother. So we had rules, and Carmela was married to Uncle Bill's second son, Tony, because his wife, mother was a father's name was Tony. But we had to distinguish between all the Tonys. My grandfather had 6 sisters, and there was a Tony in every family. Tony Tocco was called Ton from the time he was a little child. Now, where that name came from, I don't know, but we all called him Ton. And he married Mr. Profaci's second child. There was also some marriages into the family of a gentleman in Chicago who was listed for many years in the organization in Chicago. And he had 2 daughters and a niece that married into the Corrado family and the Tocco family in Detroit. There was also one of the more prominent figures later in the 60s and 70s, Peter Vitale. He was married into a New York family out of Buffalo, New York. And for people that are familiar with the history of LCN, there was a meeting in Appalachia, New York, and outside by Buffalo, was hosted by Joseph Barbera Sr. And his son, Joseph Barbera Jr., married into a family in Detroit and lived in Detroit. In fact, I stood up in the wedding, and if you see the picture of the wedding, every man in that picture has some connection to an LCN family somewhere in the country.
Let me just color something up real quick.
Yeah.
So I know this is very confusing. You need a Venn diagram to kind of keep all this straight. But to break it down to its most simplest form, Detroit wasn't just mandating that their offspring marry other offspring in Michigan. To build the power in the family and to spread the influence, there was also a encouragement for there to be intermarriage between different families. And Novi mentioned a lot of the families already, but the one that he didn't mention that I'll throw in for the final one was a guy named Nick Licata, who was originally from Detroit and had been ran out of Detroit by Novi's grandfather and great uncle. And this is the anecdote I'm about to tell you kind of exemplifies the way Detroit does business, how his grandfather made it where violence is always going to be a last resort measure. It's never going to be something that they roll out as a lot of families, murder is the way they solve problems. Any problem is solved with violence. Well, in Detroit, it was the opposite. So Nick Licata is in Detroit, Nick Licata is in Detroit in the 20s, gets into some issues with Novi's grandfather and great uncle, flees Detroit because he's got a contract on his head, relocates to Los Angeles, over the years rises in the ranks in Los Angeles to the point where he becomes underboss and is about to be named the successor to be the boss. So because of that, there needed to be something done because this was somebody that was going to have to do business with Detroit. And he had an issue with the people in Detroit. So instead of, going all crazy, his grandfather came up with a solution and said, all right, to bury the hatchet, we're going to have Black Bill Tocco, who was his great uncle, marry his daughter to Nick Licata's son, Carlo Licata. He's going to move to Detroit, and then we're going to forgive Nick Licata for the sins of the past. So it wasn't just to keep the bloodline pure, it was also to solve business problems. So, and then just to again, break it down to its simplest form, the two founding fathers of the Detroit family, Tocco and Zerilli, married off one son apiece to Joe Profaci and married two of his daughters.
Now, I want to say, Nove, we should address this because you kind of went the other way. You didn't do this. Can you talk about that a little bit?
But the drug
you
business?
did not marry within the...
No, they wanted you to marry a royal.
I didn't. I was never too enthused about the idea of marrying somebody I didn't know. And that's really not it. Engagement in our family was where you got to know the woman, and it was chaperoned. You were never allowed to date. And me and some of my contemporaries, we'd go to the Italian weddings and the women would parade their daughters in front of us. So we learned how to go to the bar and make sure everybody saw us drinking. And then they say, you don't want to go near him, he's a merguni. Merguni means drunk in Italian. And then we got the reputations of being a bunch of drunks because we didn't want to be considered. Well, and I met a woman who's French, born and raised in Detroit, and I got married. I got married to the chagrin of my family, and my grandfather and grandmother actually turned my picture. My graduation picture was on the wall of their house. They turned it over so that it faced the wall and put a black ribbon on it.
But really, the joke's on them now. I mean, Nove is still married to this woman 56 years later. So,
And believe me, it has more to do with her than me. And that was the other thing I was taught by my father and the men in my family. The woman, the father is the head of the family. He sits at the head of the table. He makes the rules for the family. But the woman is the glue, and it's up to her that keeps that. And in my household, my wife kept my family together. To her great credit, and even when I was away. Now, I made sure that she had an income and she could live and she didn't miss any meals, but she kept my kids as close as they could be, and my grandson is in the audience today, so.
So I want to, and we don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to hit a couple of things that you both can speak to. So the Detroit mob had an involvement in Las Vegas basically 3 times, right? There was the Frontier, which we've talked about in the 1960s. Eventually had to relinquish that, and Howard Hughes bought the Frontier, and they moved on. Then it was the Aladdin. The Aladdin Hotel came next. And you had a front man there, Jimmy Tamer.
Jimmy Tamer and Chucky Goldfarb.
Who knows Jimmy Tamer? Remember, there's one. I knew Tito was going to raise his hand.
They called him Jimmy Eyes.
Tell us about the Aladdin and the involvement of the Detroit mob there.
The involvement there wasn't led by Tony Zerilli or Mike Polisi because they had been convicted in hidden ownership of the Frontier. And I believe at that time also they had sold out to Howard Hughes the Silver Slipper. Mm-hmm. And then Jimmy Tamer, I can remember going to the Aladdin, and I was there on the behest of my uncle for doing some business, and Jimmy Tamer came out, and I had known him since he was a young man, and they were at the Aladdin. I believe it, I'm not sure of how the progression of how that happened after that, but I knew Mr. Tamer. I knew some of the people involved. I believe he had a sister was dating a local gentleman who was Italian originally out of Detroit.
Jimmy Tamer, just to kind of play on what I was saying about equal opportunity, like Jimmy Tamer was Middle Eastern. I believe he was Syrian or Lebanese.
Lebanese, I think.
And Jimmy Tamer was put in place to run the Aladdin by Jack Tocco.
Yeah.
Jack Tocco and Jimmy Tamer were very, very close friends, and they actually owned a country club together called Hillcrest Country Club, which was a big hangout for the LCN from the 60s into the 80s. But from the ownership of Hillcrest, Tamer and Tocco became very close. When his uncle got caught with his hand in the cookie jar at the Frontier, and they had to sell it, they needed a new endeavor, a new frontman, a new business, and they got Jimmy Tamer. I want to just tell one quick anecdote. I got to spend the last year of Tony Z's life with him. We were working on an autobiography that will never see the light of day, but I was honored to get to spend the last year and get to interview him. And he told a great story about selling the Frontier. And he told the story about going to a meeting with Howard Hughes. And he says, and Tony Z was somebody that, he dressed to the nines. I mean, he made sure that he was always impeccably, dressed, manicured, polished. And he goes into the meeting with Howard Hughes and he says, "Can you believe he's the richest man in the world and he's wearing tennis sneakers to a meeting to sell a casino?" So it was kind of like a clash of two different worlds. But Howard Hughes eventually bought the Frontier, and Detroit moved on to the Aladdin.
The Aladdin they got busted there as well. 1978, got booted out of there, and there was a whole time after that when Wayne Newton was trying to acquire the Aladdin. Johnny Carson was trying to acquire the Aladdin, and Detroit was still involved to some extent, and there was a lot of...
And the Gambinos tried to interject themselves, and 1979, 1980 was kind of... and then, like you said, Johnny Carson and Wayne Newton were in like a bidding war for who was going to get the casino.
So Detroit now needs a third venue because the Aladdin is out. So there's an idea that comes forward. This guy named Bill Pompili.
Bill Pompili is a guy from Toledo. Yep. And for people that are from our area in Detroit, Toledo is more of a suburb of Detroit than it is a suburb of Cleveland or Columbus or Dayton. You can get from the Ohio border to downtown Detroit in probably 40 minutes, 35, 40 minutes. So Toledo has always been a satellite for the Detroit family.
Yeah, Toledo belonged in Detroit's turf. Detroit called the shots in Toledo.
So a lot of gamblers from Toledo were, for lack of a better term, transferred from Ohio to the gaming and hotel industry in Las Vegas. Bill Pompili was working at the Aladdin. I believe he was a pit boss. I believe maybe at one time he was head of food and beverage or something. And
well, that was even at the Edgewater because they couldn't get a license.
That was at the okay. So Pompili came up with a pretty brilliant idea. And it was his brainchild. He got an introduction to Jack Tocco and some of Jack Tocco's people and the Corrados and people that are related to Novi. And he said, you know what? We got all these prying eyes in Las Vegas. But you realize that gambling's legal in all of Nevada. We don't have to build our next casino in Las Vegas. Let's go to Laughlin, which is about 2 hours, not even, hour and a half from here. Yeah. And he came up with this whole idea to build a casino, and they went and they got financing. They got involvement from the Buffalo Magadino crime family. They got involvement from Tony Spilatro and the Chicago guys, and they put together a deal for the Edgewater Casino. They built it between 1980 and 1981. They opened it in 81. They sold it in 83, and they were able to rip off about $10 million from that place in 20 months.
Yeah.
In $10 million in 1982 money, which is like, $100 million right now.
And just in this very eerie kind of, things that echo each other. So Pompili had a reputation already. Nevada Gaming Authority wouldn't give him a license. So what title did he adopt at the casino? The food and beverage director. This is what Lefty Rosenthal did at the Stardust in the 70s as well. So there was a model for this.
Let me draw a quick line between the two people you just said. Mm-hmm. One we know for sure, and one I feel confident in saying this because I've sourced it. So we found out after the fact, after Lefty Rosenthal passed away, we found out that he had been a cooperator the whole time. Mm-hmm. And that's why he never was arrested or indicted in any of those straw man cases.
Right.
Well, if you go through Jack Tocco's FBI file and you go through a lot of other FBI files, it becomes pretty clear that Bill Pompili was working for the government. And I've been able to have that confirmed by federal prosecutors and FBI agents. So the whole time that Bill Pompili was doing this, he was giving information to the FBI. And the FBI waited, the federal prosecutor and the FBI waited until Bill Pompili died to bring the case against Nove and his family.
Interesting.
Charging things that Bill Pompili did.
So meanwhile, do you remember the Edgewater?
Yes, I do.
Did you go down there?
No, I was involved in some. I was living in Phoenix in the early '80s when they opened the Edgewater. I wasn't in Detroit. I didn't go back into Detroit until about 1982 or '83.
Oh, okay.
And so I wasn't involved. I had some family dealings I did in Phoenix, and I was doing business there. I did not get involved at all, nor did I met this Pompili in the Aladdin when I had been in the Aladdin, but I did not participate at all in that.
Okay. So it was also in the 80s that you got busted.
Yeah.
And
Now,
can you talk about that?
Yeah, I got busted on a conspiracy and a drug conspiracy. Now, to be clear, I was shylocking, loan sharking, and 3 people came to me and, can I borrow some money? Yeah. I kind of looked the other way because we weren't supposed to be involved in drugs. One was German, one was Italian, and one was Lebanese. They came to me, they wanted to borrow money. They got busted. They indicted me on one conspiracy, one count of conspiracy. They never caught me. I was never involved in any drug dealings or anything like that. I was the money man behind the scenes. And they came to me and they said, look, they want you because of your name. The Lebanese gentleman had been down before. He says, I'm looking at the rest of my life in prison. I don't want to do it. They'll offer me 10 years. The other kid that had been a second-time loser, he was the best man at my wedding. He says, look, if you plead guilty to a charge, they'll give me 6 years. The other kid was a first-timer. They said, if you plead guilty, they'll give me 5 years. I thought and I was taught this, when you're a leader of men, you lead men, you don't stand behind them and act as their shield. And I know that sounds a little strange coming from a family that was insulated, but I was taught how to be a leader of men. And I thought it was my obligation, so I took the bus so that they could all get lighter sentences. I did 5 years, and I didn't get back into Detroit until 1992.
We don't have to, I think it was like 90, 91. We don't have to name names here, but there were some pretty significant LCN figures that were
doing business
in the background of your dealings.
Yes, there were some LCN figures in the background of my dealings,
right.
Yes. And some of the people that were going into that business, in the 70s and the 80s, you remember the movie Scarface? Southern Florida was awash with cocaine. You couldn't walk into a nightclub anywhere in Detroit and go in the bathroom where somebody's not snorting coke. Everybody, it was a social thing.
And the profit margins were so huge.
Yeah, and the profit margins were huge. I mean, I never snorted coke. I got a sinus problem, so that was like throwing money. So I never got involved with that. But and like I said, I was in the money business, and that's what I thought was the honorable thing to do, and that's what I did. It cost my wife some hard times. She didn't miss a meal. I had a business in Phoenix in which she got a salary. So that didn't. I didn't get back into Detroit until late 90, I think it was. Late 91. I didn't get out of prison until 91.
Okay.
I got out Thanksgiving in 91. Okay,
So this leads into really, when you think about, if you guys come to the museum, you've seen Frank Calabrese Jr. talk here, and he talked in Chicago, and he talks about the family secrets trial in Chicago. The version of that in Detroit was the Operation Game Tax, which was a huge case that preceded the family secrets by about 10 years. And what I want to do is give Scott a chance to summarize it and then we'll go back to Novi to talk about how he got caught up in this business and how it all played out. But talk about what Operation Game Tactic.
It was a case 30 years in the making. The charges that dropped in March of '96 went all the way back to 1967. So it was 29
Frontier
years
and everything.
of investigations. And, you know, it was the only sledgehammer that the government was ever able to take to the Tocco Zerilli family. They had been trying for years and years, couldn't get any traction. They've tried years and years since then and really haven't got much traction. But they found a sweet spot in the 90s where, because of a combination of things, they were able to build a case. Novi was kind of in the middle of it in the sense that he was doing a lot of street stuff. He came back, and Novi can talk about this, came back and with his cousin, Paulie Corrado, who had actually spent time in Las Vegas running around with Tony Spilatro on behalf of the Detroit guys, moved back there. They both moved back, and with the blessing of his uncle Tony Z, went around consolidating a lot of bookmakers and loan sharks that weren't paying tribute. They had learned from a case in New York City where they had bugged a Jaguar that was being used by a mafia don in New York named Tony Ducks Corallo, who was driving around all day in a car talking to his bodyguard and driver. They bugged the car. They were able to, and they tried to replicate this in Detroit. And Novi went to a poker game one night. He'll tell the story. And next thing you know, his car's bugged for a couple years. And it was, you know, for somebody who read all these transcripts before I ever met Novi, it's definitely a lot of insight into the world of Goodfellas.
So Novi, what were they capturing on this bug?
What they captured, first of all, Paulie Corrado is my cousin. He's 11 years younger than me. And me and him both went back to Detroit about the same time. I was out of prison and he came back from living here in Las Vegas. And we both were, in the talk of the streets, we had the shorts. We were both trying to build our lives over again. I had been in prison. Prison costs not only attorney fees, but in my case, I had to make sure that my wife and my children were taken care of. So it costs. I was broke. I went back to Detroit where I could make a living. And me and Paul got together, and we see a lot of non-Italian people in the numbers, booking the state number. They were booking sports, and they were running different rackets. So me and Paul said, you know, these people, they ain't none of, like Scott said, my uncle said, you know, go make a living. So me and Paulie went on the street and we started grabbing Middle Eastern people, Polish people, whoever we could get, and we were charging them street tax. That brought a lot of heat. There was an Italian restaurant on the east side me and Paul used to go to on every Wednesday night. The bookmakers used to call Wednesday night in Detroit pay and take. And there's a few bookmakers from Detroit in here that know what I'm talking about. We called it pay and take, and that was the day that what you figured out, you made restitution for whether you won or lost with your bookmaker. In this Italian restaurant, there was a number of bookmakers that were working for me and my cousin. And we would go in there, and guys would come in all night. And then at 2 a.m, the owner of the restaurant, who was from the same hometown in Sicily that my family was from, he would lock the door and we'd stay in, and we'd stay till 4 a.m. drinking and playing cards and whatnot. Well, it was a snowy winter night, and I guess the FBI had an office across the street, and they took our cars, went over there and bugged my car and Paulie's car, and then brought them back and threw snow on our cars so we wouldn't know they were out. I guess they were out there all night trying to fix the tire tracks in the snow and everything. And that's ended up in a bug, and that bug has me and Paul discussing business, our street business, and how we would convince people that it was more profitable to pay us street tax than make enemies of us.
I think there was a delineation, though, that needs to be made. in terms of some of the inside baseball, because there became issues between the Zerilli faction of the family and the Tocco faction of the family. And Novi and Paulie went and got permission to go after guys that weren't spoken for. And I'm not endorsing extortion or shakedowns, but in mafia protocol, if you're not on record with anybody, it's open season. So he went and got permission from his uncle. Jack Tocco and Tawn Tocco signed off on it. And then when they saw them having success and getting what they were trying to go get, they came to you and said, where's our piece?
Yeah.
And that caused friction because Novi and his people had gotten permission, and it started to fray the structure of the family.
That was the crack within the family. The two cousins, my uncle Tony Zerilli and his cousin Jack Tocco, started to have little issues between them over the whole thing. And me and Paulie were in the middle, and we were trying to make a living, and they were taking issue that we were trading on their name, but they forgot one thing: it's my name too. And I had spent my life learning how to trade on the streets. Jack Tocco was kind of the prince that never left the castle.
But they also had greenlit you. It wasn't like they were coming to you and saying they gave you permission to do this.
Yeah. I
guess they didn't think it was going to be very successful. And then when it was successful, they're like, okay, now we want to cut into you.
And very bluntly in a meeting, there's some talk on these tapes about that meeting, I told Jack Tocco and his brother, you want a piece of my action? Come out in the car, put on the black clothes, let's go out on the street at night, and you can earn your piece along with me. And I told him, I said, there's an old Sicilian saying, the man that tries to eat the whole loaf chokes. And that's what I told Jack. I says, I'm not trying to eat the whole loaf. You want a piece? Come on in and earn it.
Put on a ski mask and put on your gloves and get in the car with me and go do the dirt.
So we still have a fair amount of ground to cover, so I want to keep going. So it's Operation Game Tax. Ultimately, I'm going to make sure I say this right. You're convicted, along with a number of other individuals. You get how many years? 16 years?
18 years.
18 years. Jack Tocco gets
1 year.
One year.
1 year.
Interesting, right?
Yeah.
So how does this?
It's never happened before.
How does this settle with you?
Doesn't settle very good.
Yeah.
First of all, Jack's the boss. He's convicted as a boss of the RICO conspiracy. There's no boss in the United States
ever
that got less than 20 years. Jack gets 1 year.
As an example, when you go back to the commission case in New York, the boss has got 99 years.
Right. Yeah.
So 2 years.
And I got 18 years. Now, to tell you the truth, I got 18 years because I had been convicted of a felony prior. So that was probably, by the guidelines, justified by the law. My wife didn't like it too much. And Paulie, who was a first-time loser, got 13 years. 13 years. First-time loser, 13 years. Jack Tocco, first-time loser, gets a year. Paulie's uncle, Tony Corrado, gets 5 years, first-time loser. Billy Jagaloni, a 7 or 8 time loser, gets 4 years. All right? And the whole trial, and if we do a podcast with a gentleman by the name of Rick Convertino, who was a prosecutor on my case. I have met Rick since then. He's a gentleman by the old world standard, and I kind of like him. I liked him during the trial. I don't have any animosity toward any of those men that were doing their job. And even he said, in the trial, it was obvious. It's what me and Paul call a dry snitch. A dry snitch is somebody who points the finger to somebody by things they do and things they say and never said he did it, but they dry snitch it. And obviously, the judge believed him because me and Paul caught the brunt of it.
The whole strategy of the leadership of the family at that time, meaning Tony Tocco and Jack Tocco, the entire strategy at that trial was to point the finger at Novi and Paulie.
Yeah.
So he felt, and I don't want to speak for you, that you got thrown under the bus.
A gentleman by the name of Tony Jagaloni, who was #1 suspect in the Jimmy Hoffa disappearance. My uncle, Tony Zerilli, was also on that trial. Both of those gentlemen were out of the trial because of health issues. Both were very serious. Tony Jagiellone never went to trial. He died before he went to trial. And my uncle went to trial some years later. So as it turned out, a year later, we win the appeal. The case is overthrown. It's kicked back to the district judge. I run into Paul. We were in different prisons, but they brought us both back into Macomb County Holding. And I saw Paul. I said, Paul, we got to bargain our way out of this, or we're going to be, I'm going to die an old man in that prison. I was 50 years old at the time. And he said, no. He says, I'm going to fight it. Well, I bargained my way out of it. And a lot of people think, why? Well, number one, my father was indicted. My father never broke a law in his life. My father was indicted because something on a tape where he's giving me advice, and how he got in that car and was heard was my dad called me one day and says, I'm leaving my car at the dealership for service. Can you pick me up? I said, yeah, Dad. I pick him up. He gets in the car, and I said, come on, Dad, I got to go to the west side to pick up some money. I said, we'll go to that Jewish deli you like, and I'll buy you a pastrami sandwich. My dad ends up indicted in a...
Now, he gets an extortion count because he's in the car when
he's in extortion when I go out to collect. My dad didn't even know what I was doing. Okay, so now I got my father involved. 80-year-old man is looking at prison. I got a brother and my nephew that have been busted for bookmaking. They're looking at time. I bargained the whole deal out, and I said, I'll take it. Everybody else walks. It worked. I got 5 years. Paulie refused and was reconvicted and given 13 years. He ended up doing 11. I did 5.
Now, Novi, you did testify at the resentencing
of Jack
Tocco.
At this time, it was we were completely split. I had had enough of him.
Novi didn't, but it gets conflated that Novi convicted Jack Tocco.
This is the resentencing.
This was,
It was a resentence,
right.
And I did testify at the resentencing. And he got, instead of getting a year, he got a year and a half.
Yeah.
Right.
And so obviously there was something with the judge. And then I learned later that there in fact was something with the judge. If you ask me what it was, I don't know. I wasn't in the room. But there was something.
There was a relationship between the judge. What we know for sure was there was a relationship between the judge's son and Jack Tocco's son.
Yeah. And I ended up doing my time and came home. And Paulie did 11 years. And...
Now, Novi, you were in witness protection for a brief time?
Yeah, they threw me out of witness protection.
Why'd they throw you out?
I guess I knew too much law for them. One of the parole officers was trying to dictate what law is, and they said, that's not the law, and if you're going to press that on me, I'm not going to stand for it. And then we were in Atlanta, Georgia, and I don't think they like too many Italians in Atlanta, Georgia.
I've heard
And
somebody
he made
say
a
that
comment
before.
to me. He says, "You people
Frank
are always
Milano.
trying to run the." I says, "Me people? You mean Italians? What are you talking? You don't like Italians?" Well, he kind of admitted it to me without admitting it. And me and him had a falling out, so the marshals threw me out. And that parole officer refused to allow me to go back to Phoenix, where I had a home and my family was. My wife had to hire an attorney to get me to go to Phoenix.
So you spent some quality time in Arizona.
I lived in Arizona until 2012 or 2013 after I got out.
Yeah.
And my mother had passed away.
Yeah.
And my father was alone. I was the oldest son. It was my duty to go home and take care of him. And me and my wife went and we took care of my father until he passed away.
Is it accurate to say you kind of waited till Jack Tocco passed?
No.
No.
I didn't care about Jack Tocco.
Okay.
And I didn't care about his brother anymore. And very frankly, I was concerned with taking care of my family.
Got it. So when you came back to Detroit, was that nerve-wracking at first? Were you worried that someone was going to take you out?
No, because at that time, a man who was the son of Billy Jagiellone was supposed to have taken over. I knew Jackie Jagiellone since he was a child. And among us guys on the streets in the 80s, 90s, we used to say Jackie couldn't bust a potato chip. He was not a violent guy. Jack was a big earner, but he knew nothing about violence. And all the people around him who knew anything about violence, I knew him before Jackie did. So I wasn't too concerned. And some of the old timers that were left, were too old to want to get involved in street antics anymore. Most of them have passed away since, and Jackie had some bad luck with a daughter, and she's been in a coma for I don't know how many years since.
That's right.
His time
Happened
is spent
here, didn't it?
Yeah, it happened.
Yeah, and his time is spent with him and his wife taking care of a daughter in a coma.
Now, how have you been received by family members since you came back to?
My immediate family, members of the Zerilli family, Joe Zerilli's family, I am warmly received. I am still the oldest grandson. I still see all of them. By some of the extended members, Tony Corrado's kids and Jack Tocco's kids, we don't speak and we don't see each other. As far as Paul Corrado and him, no, I see Paulie all the time. We're very close.
So it's worked out, more or less,
Yes.
coming back?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Novi, I have one final question for Scott, but before we do that, I want to ask you about looking back on your life, looking back on your experiences in Detroit and elsewhere. I mean, what would you do differently? How do you feel about it, looking back on your life?
I probably wouldn't do a lot differently. I never looked at breaking the law as my moral compass. It was breaking my grandfather's rules as my moral compass. When I did, it cost me. And that was that drug case. I shouldn't have been loaning those people money. That was breaking one of his rules. And to this day, I still love and honor my grandfather, both my grandfathers. Everybody in Detroit used to call my grandfather, whose name was Joseph, they used to call him, the people involved in the outfit or organization, referred to my grandfather as Subipino, which means Uncle Joe. The only man he referred to by uncle was my other grandfather. He called him Sunovrio. That was the only man he referred to. So I had two grandfathers that had a lot of respect within the Sicilian community. And hopefully, I hope neither one of them are turning over in their grave, because I think I followed the rules that they taught me. And my father was also a man of honor. He never broke a law. He didn't have to. He made a good living. I was a little bit, I don't know, a little more wild than he was.
Rough around the edges.
Yeah, rough around the edges. But I caused my mother and my wife and my sister's heartache. I think if I regret anything, the heartache I caused them, I regret.
Tough on your wife for going to prison and stuff?
Anytime you spend a lot of money defending yourself and you're away for a long period of time and it's still your responsibility to care. My wife went through not financially so many hard times, but I'm sure there were moments of her being lonely, raising the kids alone, things like that.
Yeah.
From somebody that has met a lot of the Zerilli women, I mean, these are women that should be up for sainthood. I mean, Rosalie Profaci, she's almost 95 right now.
Yeah.
And this woman is one of, if not the most amazing woman I've ever met. And she kind of, I think, represents that Zerilli female swagger
She's
or
always,
vibe.
And when the rest of my family was shunning me, she always liked my wife. Always, that woman.
And is it accurate, Scott, that you're working on bringing Rosalie here to the Mob Museum?
I hope. I would love to. I don't think her family would be that thrilled about it, but Rosalie has been so good to
I'm
me.
just kidding.
And it's funny because the first time I talked to her, she hung up the phone on me and told me that I was besmirching her husband's reputation. And then we met maybe 5 years later, and she became like a grandma to me. And I sincerely, I love her with all my heart. And she really, I don't say that lightly. Like, this woman has been through so much, to this day, has been through so much. And it just is the picture of resilience and compassion and elegance. Mm-hmm. And I know that her father would be incredibly proud of the woman that she became.
So this month marks the 50th anniversary of the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa. Some younger folks in the, today probably don't even know who Jimmy Hoffa was.
It's a generational gap.
While
with
others
knowledge.
might have heard the name, but they don't understand what all the fuss is about, right? But I think that's why it's important for us to talk a little bit about this. Please explain, if you could, Scott. Scott's one of the top 2 or 3 authorities on Jimmy Hoffa in the country. He might say number 1, but right up there. And
me and Dan Moldea.
Yeah, Dan Moldea, who's also spoken here.
We're the Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig of this thing.
There you go. And explain to us who Jimmy Hoffa was and why 50 years after his death, some of us are still obsessed with him.
Well, I mean, people that maybe weren't alive when Jimmy Hoffa was prominent, I wasn't, and I've had to learn about this. I didn't experience it. But this was one of the most powerful, one of the most recognizable in terms of face recognition, people on the planet in the 1960s. I mean, he was a quasi head of state. He was getting the same type of ink that the president got.
He was treated that way in Las Vegas, too.
Right. And he was somebody that was incredibly proud and ferocious in both good and bad ways, tenacious, and was put into place in the Teamsters by Nove's grandfather and uncle. There was actually a scene in the movie Hoffa where he meets with Nove's grandfather. Jack Nicholson meets with a character that's portraying Nove's grandfather. And then there's for lack of a better term, a vendetta by the US government, by the Kennedys, to go after Jimmy Hoffa. And it's a very public feud that plays out on national television. Eventually, they convict Jimmy Hoffa of jury tampering, bribery, and fraud, and he has to go to prison. He's sentenced to, I think, 12 years, which he does almost 5 of, and it might have been 15 years that he did almost 5 of, and gets a commutation from the Nixon White House, comes out of prison in late 71. He had to relinquish his presidency in the Teamsters in order to gain the commutation. Nothing meant more to Jimmy Hoffa than the Teamsters Union. It was more important to him than his family, than his own livelihood. It meant everything to him. And after experiencing life without Jimmy Hoffa as the president, the powers that be in La Cosa Nostra, not just in Detroit, but around the country, decided that we like this. He was replaced by his vice president, Frank Fitzsimmons. Hoffa was a pit bull. Frank Fitzsimmons was a lapdog. Frank Fitzsimmons was somebody that could be easily puppeted and easily manipulated. Hoffa was not. Hoffa was, like I said, he was a bull in a china shop. And the mob told Jimmy Hoffa that he was no longer welcomed in the Teamsters Union. Hoffa did not take that news very well and became obsessed with reclaiming the union. When he got off parole in 73, he started going on a national media campaign, going on 60 Minutes and other, interviewing with Walter Cronkite and threatening these very mobsters that had put him in power, telling the whole world that you can't keep me out of the union. I'm going to run again in 1976. I'm going to win in a landslide, which he would have. And I'm going to get back in power. I'm going to kick all you guys out. And I'm going to cut off access to the pension fund, which was the golden goose that laid the golden eggs. So when it became clear that he would not relent, no matter how many times people went and saw Jimmy Hoffa and said, listen, this is a no-win situation for you. He didn't want to hear it. He thought he was above it all, thought that he was untouchable. And eventually there was a campaign of violence that was going back and forth between Hoffa loyalists and mob loyalists. And the final straw was 20 days before Hoffa disappeared, on July 10th, 1975, at a local bar that was frequented by Teamsters called Nemo's. It's still around. Nove and I were there a week or two ago. Frank Fitzsimmons and his son, their car was firebombed in the parking lot of Nemo's. The perception was that Jimmy Hoffa had put a hit on the Fitzsimmons, and at that point, there became a consensus made across the country in La Cosa Nostra circles that Hoffa had to go. Detroit got the contract, and 20 days later, he disappeared, has never been found. The mythology seems to grow bigger every day, every year, every second. It feeds on itself, the mystique, the folklore of it all. And I think because there's no body, he disappeared from a restaurant parking lot about 2:45 on July 30th, 1975 in Bloomfield Township, which was about 7 miles north of the city of Detroit. Never to be found again. And I think the reason the interest is still, in a lot of ways, it's evergreen. It's
a mystery.
It's some people call it the greatest unsolved mystery in American history. It's iconic. It's embedded in the fabric of Americana. But I think it would be different if he would have just been killed. Mm-hmm. And they had a body, and they buried the body, and it was a really big deal when it happened. But the fact that there is no body has people running around on this wild goose chase.
And no clear killer either. That's the other. I mean, even though I know.
I think the FBI has a pretty good idea who killed him, how he was killed, why he was killed, where he was killed. But just because an investigator knows what happened doesn't mean you have enough ammunition to bring a case. And the last thing I'll say is I've interviewed 4 different people that the FBI considers to have been involved in the conspiracy. And one of them said to me, if we had to do it all over again, we would have left him in the parking lot of the restaurant, laid out, we would have shot him in the head. It would have all been over with now. We wouldn't still be talking about it.
Yeah. One last question about, Nove, did you ever meet Jimmy Hoffa?
Yes. I was in the labor movement in the 70s. I was director of organization for the Hotel Restaurant Union, which is big in this town.
Yeah.
That was the biggest local. The Hotel Restaurant Union was the biggest local in that international union. I was director of organization of that when Jimmy Hoffa disappeared. I used to do a lot of work with some of the Teamsters. I had met Jimmy Hoffa. It was at a Teamster function, and I can't put a time to it. I just don't remember. I was with some Teamsters, and they introduced me to him. I did not know him personally. My father did know him personally from the 30s. My dad was a truck driver in a produce business, and both my grandfathers knew Jimmy Hoffa because they did business in the produce.
Your uncle was very close to him, too.
And my uncle knew him, but was close to him. But I'm talking about before my uncle was old enough to wear long pants. My grandfathers knew Jimmy Hoffa, and he did have a reputation, as Scott said, that he was a tough, hard-nosed street guy, and but an intelligent street man, and he built much of this town. To my knowledge, and I don't know if I've ever said this to you, to my knowledge, the Teamster pension fund, and I can remember when I would make arrangements for loans from the teacher pension fund, and there was always been a finder's fee involved, and I think Scott can speak to it.
I mean, I think that was part of the desire to move from Hoffa to Fitzsimmons.
Yeah,
Fitzsimmons didn't want as much of a kickback as Hoffa did.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is all those loans, the Teamsters pension fund did not lose a dime. They made money. That pension fund prospered because when you got a loan through an LCN group to build a hotel in Las Vegas, you would damn well better pay it back.
It's okay to rob the casino as long as you pay back the loan that built
paid the loan. It was okay to, but that everybody had to make a little bit of money.
So Nove, when Hoffa disappeared, did you have a pretty good idea of what had happened right then?
Yes.
Okay.
But that's something that in my position at that time in Detroit, you don't ask a question you don't want to hear the answer to. And incidentally, the FBI did come into my office and scared the hell out of my secretary and cornered me in the back and asked me a bunch of questions about Jimmy Hoffa.
Interesting.
You know, and my poor secretary was crying when they came in.
Well, why don't we open this up for a few questions from the audience? I assume everybody's been thinking about this. We have microphones that we'll bring around. So if you raise your hand, we'll bring the microphone to you. Why don't we start here in the front, actually? We can?
I could ask a million questions, but I'm related by marriage to a Polish Catholic priest that was in Detroit during all this time.
Okay.
What was the relationship between the families and the church? And how did that play into what happened in Detroit?
The Italian Catholic Church in Detroit was was originally on a street in the ghetto called Hastings Street, which in the turn of the 20th century was where the Italian immigrants lived. That was called the Holy Family Church. My family was both my grandfathers, my father, I was baptized in that Holy Family Church. Most of our cousins were married in that Holy Family Church, and I knew a lot of the priests there. When I was a young man, there was the pastor there was Father Benedict, and I can say truthfully he was a true priest.
There was a very, very strong relationship between the organization and the church. To this day, I'm not going to mention a name, the specific name, but a pretty high-ranking guy in the last 10 years sold a business to Ascension Healthcare. Ascension Healthcare is owned by the Archdiocese. Sold it for $50 million. And you would think that there would have been a little bit more vetting and background checking, but it demonstrates the ties in the church.
Yeah. All right. Another question.
I introduced myself earlier to Novi, but I grew up in the neighborhood. I used to ride my bike. We used to play at Trombley Schoolyard. In fact, I went to school there. We used to ride our bikes by Middlesex, by all the houses, going to the park, as kids. You have to picture this neighborhood. The grass was always cut. The neighborhood was in perfect shape. There was no activity on the street. I give a compliment to Novi's family and how they just were part of the neighborhood.
And they weren't wanted.
Right.
Getting an opportunity to interview his uncle, he told me the story about how the Italians moved into Grosse Pointe. I mean, this was for lack of a better term, a very waspy neighborhood that did not like ethnicities. And after Prohibition, around the time when Prohibition was ending, his grandfather went and sat down with the mayor of Grosse Pointe and said, guess what? We're all moving in and there's nothing you can do about it. But believe me, we're gonna make it worth your while. We're gonna make this place as safe can be. We're gonna make it as clean can be. We're gonna put a ton of money into your economy. And as a result, there was a compound. I mean, it was 10, 12 houses all together in the same one or two
it
blocks.
wasn't like The Godfather. We weren't all at the end of the street. Okay, and that gentleman, when he said Trombley School, he knows exactly what I mean. The street Middlesex was a boulevard. It had two sides. My Uncle Bill and my Uncle Pete, both my great uncles, lived on one side. My grandfather and my uncle lived on the other side. Down the street was Jack Tocco and his brother Ton lived a block down. My Uncle Bill's daughter lived across the street from Uncle Bill's house. But it was a boulevard, and in between there were regular American people.
And there's always been, Novi will dispel it right now, there's always been a lot of rumors in Detroit urban mythology about the tunnels that went underneath all the houses so they could hold meetings underground, and Novi has dispelled that.
Well, I'll tell you the story, really. My Uncle Pete's house, my great Uncle Pete, which was a Corrado, was directly across the street from my grandfather's house. For some reason, he gets this bright idea that they want to have a barbecue that looks like a tree in the back house. Well, he cocks my grandfather to putting a barbecue that looks like a tree in his backyard, too. They were the worst barbecues in the world. Nobody could ever get a fire to stay lit, and they couldn't do any food. Well, this mythology came that was the lead to the tunnel.
It was like a secret door in the tree.
Secret door in the tree. Now, I was the first 7 years of my life, I lived in that house. I knew every foot of that house. I knew there was no tunnel. Geraldo Rivera went over there trying to find a tunnel. There was no tunnel. There was a room behind the fireplace in the basement. And as I got older, I told my grandma, I said, Grandma, behind that bookcase in that firehouse, there's this room. She says, how do you know that? I said, Grandma, I was standing here when the carpenter made it. She says, no, there isn't. I says, Grandma, go outside and count the windows. She said, what are you talking about? I said, there's a basement window in the room. They got 4 windows down here, there's 3. Come on. Well, what it was a wine cellar. My grandfather had wine in that rack. And that was all it was. There was nothing in there but wine. And then behind his fruit room, there was an old dungery room that they used to make wine with when they were kids. I mean, when they were young men. My Uncle Pete, my grandfather, would go back there with a barrel and crush wine. You're like, how many Italian people's grandfather made wine in the basement? That's what they did.
Gotcha. There's a question back here, I think.
In regard to the book and the movie, The Irishman, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's don't believe one single word that was said in that movie. It's historical blasphemy. And frankly, Marty Scorsese and Robert De Niro should, I don't want to say be ashamed of themselves, but it's a situation where they, in my opinion, should have understood that in terms of this world, what comes from them is going to be considered the gospel. Mm-hmm. So I think you need to, don't take that responsibility lightly. And I think they were a little bit too laissez-faire with, we're just telling a story. It's like, no, you're telling people this is what happened to Jimmy Hoffa, and this is not what happened to Jimmy Hoffa. And you're naming a person who killed Jimmy Hoffa who never had anything really to do with Jimmy Hoffa other than knowing Jimmy Hoffa. But I've spoken to people in the federal government. First of all, let me just tell you, every FBI agent dismisses this. Every U.S. prosecutor dismisses this. And in fact, I've talked to a number of FBI agents who said, not only did Frank Sheeran not kill Jimmy Hoffa, the entire narrative that's put out in that movie that Frank Sheeran was some hitman, that he painted houses, was all a fallacy as well. They said, we can't find, this is FBI agents, we can't find one murder to tie him to, let alone Jimmy Hoffa.
I mean, it's pretty clear. We could do a whole program just on this book, but Frank Sheeran changed his story 4 times.
Yeah, he tried to sell the book. I know because I shared an agent with Frank Sheeran. He went out to try to sell that book 2 or 3 times, didn't say one word about Jimmy Hoffa or killing Jimmy Hoffa. And then there was a conversation that was held and said, you want to sell this book? Tell everybody you killed Jimmy Hoffa, and he did, and
by
he
the
sold
end,
the book.
He killed Joey Gallo, too.
Right, he says he killed crazy Joey Gallo, which is obviously false. And but it's the con from the grave. He's the one who's got the last laugh.
There is no circumstances under which something like that would have happened in Detroit by somebody outside of Detroit. They simply would not have allowed it. Completely, the person who contemplated that would have ended up in a grave faster than Jimmy Hoffa.
And really, to me, maybe the biggest cardinal sin in that movie, outside of what I just said, was the way they portrayed Tony Giacalone. It was so offensive. I mean, offensive. They portrayed Tony Giacalone in that movie as some type of gopher or water boy, when in fact, Tony Giacalone was the quarterback of the entire conspiracy, and they made it look like he was literally carrying Tony Provenzano's luggage. It was offensive.
Tony Provenzano probably wouldn't have been allowed in.
Tony Provenzano would have been carrying Tony Giacalone's luggage, not the other way around.
You can see we have a Detroit perspective coming from this. Do we have maybe one more?
I was just wondering, where did Tony Provenzano fit in this whole story? Because
barely anywhere. The most overrated character in the entire Hoffa drama.
The prison confrontation.
What is that?
The prison confrontation.
Oh, you mean what was the? issue between Hoffa and
Well, no, what I'm
Provenzano?
looking at is where did he fit? Because I know Provenzano was from New Jersey, and you guys are part of Michigan.
Right. He didn't fit anywhere. He was used as a pawn to get Hoffa out into the open because they knew that if Hoffa was going to take over the union, Hoffa knew he had to make amends with Tony Provenzano, who was a former ally and close friend that had become a bitter enemy from a feud that they had in prison. Tony Provenzano had wanted to kill Jimmy Hoffa for 7 years and would have killed him if he could have killed him. This really had nothing to do with Tony Provenzano. He was inserted into this narrative, and it's taken on a life of its own. And in reality, I don't think Tony Provenzano knew anything, did anything, and possibly didn't have any of his, there's been a lot of speculation that some of his people were in Detroit at the time of the disappearance. And I think it's possible that there was nobody from New Jersey there. And this was 100% a Detroit job. But I can tell you for sure that Tony Provenzano had zero authority in the decision to murder Jimmy Hoffa.
So we'll take one more question. It's up front here. We have bring the microphone to you.
Hi, thanks for being here tonight. Just curious, I heard you mention Buffalo. What about the New York City, New Jersey? Was there any interaction or any disputes?
Detroit dealt with all of them. Detroit had relationships with all the families. His grandfather was close to every boss in the country.
And I heard a lot of ethnicities mentioned, but I didn't hear the Irish mentioned.
Detroit never had a huge Irish population.
The only Irish that would have been involved with Detroit would have been some Teamsters. And in fact, I was running around with a couple Irish Teamsters at the time in the 70s.
There was Irish organized crime during Prohibition, but for whatever reason, Detroit never really had an Irish organized crime group and never really had a subgroup within the Zerilli Tocco group that was Irish, for whatever reason.
Well, I think we better let you guys ask questions of those guys afterward, but let's all round of applause for our speakers, too.